Hey everyone, welcome to episode 7 of Farming Fast and Slow with Adam Wolf. And I'm stepping in for Adam Wolf this week. And I'm excited because we're joined by two special guests, Trenton Franz and John Heaston. Trenton Franz is an associate professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and his research focuses on understanding how ecosystems function and exploring how to use water use efficiency, how to increase water use efficiency in food production. He has a PhD from Princeton University. And we're also joined by John Heaston, who focuses on environmental, economic, and agricultural issues as they relate to basin development and watershed management. He has anthropology degrees from University of Nebraska and has studied applied anthropology at University of Kentucky. I'm super excited to have you both on our webinar today, partly because of the kickoff for UNL TAPS and because of this slight frustration I've experienced looking at water sustainability reporting and wanting to get a better understanding of what are ways that we can improve those metrics and data collection in the field in a way that's also realistic for farmers. So just a few housekeeping items before we kick off today. There's a question and answer button on the bottom of your screen. So if you want to submit questions during the conversation, we'll go through them at the end. And this will be recorded, so it will be available on our website after the show. And with that, John, I actually wanted to turn it over to you first. You've lived in Nebraska your whole life and have focused on water issues in the state. Nebraska's unique in water management, so I was hoping you could provide us an overview on how it works with the different NRD systems and how you think about water.
Sure. I want to correct you slightly. I lived in Kentucky for 3 years, and the football team won 2 national championships while I was gone, and then turned to crap, so they made kicking me out, their mojo back. But Nebraska, we're kind of a unique animal when it comes to water management because the way water works in this state is very different than a lot of the states. We have more water variability from our southeast corner to our northwest corner than you would from the Missouri River to the Atlantic Ocean. And so about every 30 to 50 miles, you're seeing a rainfall gradient change and growing days and growing hours. And so the way we have one state with one set of regulations, but the way people interact with it is very different depending on where they are in the state and what types of crops that they grow. But one thing that is pretty constant across the state is irrigation. In the east, it's used more as insurance, and in the west, it's just an absolute necessity. But how you get to profitability through irrigation has been very highly volatile over the years. And so you asked about NRDs, we have 23 natural resource districts across the state, and they're basically set up on sub-watersheds. And as an attempt at bioregional governance, they're pretty good, but in terms of trying to apply regulation to water management at a basin scale based on individual performance, it's kind of like pushing a dry rope up a wet hill or a wet rope up a dry hill. There's varying degrees of success with it, and some do better than others. But I'd say, just as a final thought on that, I'm turning 50 at the end of the summer, and in my 50 years of being here, I've spent a lot of that in and around irrigated agriculture. I grew up in a farm community out in central Nebraska, and the amount of change in adoption and practice and technology in those 50 years has been amazing, and what we're doing today bears little resemblance to what we were doing in the 70s. And so it makes it a challenge with the game changing the way it is all the time.
That's super interesting. And Trenton, to get your perspective, the other day we were talking about water management and conservation, and some of the things that we're doing with arable and looking at farmer adoption. And you mentioned that the way farmers think about it is really, you know, what can I do this year to save 5 or 6 inches in terms of technology adoption, and then there's an additional potential 1 to 2 inches that farmers can save if they're really good at it. So I was just hoping that you could explain a little bit more about what are these tools that farmers are using today, and then what are the more progressive growers using, and how expensive is it?
Yeah, and first of all, thanks for the invitation. Enjoyed talking with you guys, and also for John and sort of tutoring me over the last couple of years and getting me up to speed on some of the Nebraska water issues. So just echoing what John said, you know, it's really quite a range across the state. So depending on kind of you know, the individual NRD and kind of what water year is happening and kind of what level of risk is the individual producer or farmer willing to take. So, you know, we kind of find with our research and looking in the literature that, you know, soil moisture probes are, you know, very effective at, you know, minimizing the amount of irrigation, really, you know, trying to come up with you know, great optimization that way. Now, however, there's some challenges with that, is, you know, getting these probes in the field, you know, understanding what the actual data means and how to get the, you know, even reading the graph and turning that into a decision is quite a, you know, a hindrance, especially if you're new to some of these technologies. And so it's really sort of, you know, a range of, you know, what technology is most beneficial to you as a producer, and how can you save that time and actual water amount. So, you know, some people, it's just a matter of, you know, getting remote, you know, access to their pivots, and controlling that is just a great, you know, first step for the kind of technology. And then you add in, you know, additional things like soil moisture probes, or, you know, reference ET or ET as they sort of get more comfortable with the technology.
Great. And along that, I guess along that train of thought, you know, most of the folks in Nebraska have invested in certain types of irrigation infrastructure. And I'm thinking, you know, with the UNL TAPS this year, one of the things, or I guess last year, we were doing the SDI, the subsurface drip in corn. And I was wondering, you know, looking at the cost of that, is that a direction that you think it's going in Nebraska, or does that still not make sense?
So I certainly think there's certain, you know, kind of weirdly shaped parcels of land, or certain sections where SDI is pretty cost effective, but in terms of overall adoption, I think it's still pretty limited. John might know more of the details there, but I think it's still a fairly niche kind of you know, market, from my understanding.
Yeah,
Got it.
yeah. Let me jump in there. Subsurface drip has been around in Nebraska for probably close to 20 years, and where you're still seeing it mostly is, as Trent described, on odd-shaped fields, but probably you're more likely to see it in seed corn than you would in number 2 yellow or food grade production. The value per acre is just not there versus center pivot or gravity irrigation for most producers, unless they're being heavily subsidized. I do know some NRDs have cost shared on subsurface drip for water savings. But one of the other things that you run afoul of is that we have two issues that reduce the use life of subsurface drip. Rodent damage is pretty easy to spot and pretty prolific throughout. The ground squirrels and gophers like to get down into those tape runs and chew on them. And then the other big issue is that the alkaline nature of most of the water in Nebraska really reduces the effective use life of those tapes by gumming them up. And so, you know, if you want them to have a longer use life, then you also have to invest in some sort of brine solution tank, and those get pretty pricey pretty quick. You do see them used on corners and field ends from time to time, but right now I would say there's still, until that price point comes down, they're still kind of running in last place as far as irrigation preference.
Got it. And this concept, and this might be wrong way of thinking about it. But John, this conversation that we had three or so years ago, where we talked about the amount of investment that growers put into irrigation infrastructure and just capital expenses in general on the farm, and how that limits their ability to grow different crops. And so they're, I don't want to use the word stuck, but feel stuck in growing certain corn or certain commodity crops every year rather than transitioning to higher value crops. And so I was wondering if it's just a limitation that some type of irrigation infrastructure investment could change.
Right. So there's an old saying that when you make bacon and eggs, the chicken is involved, but the pig is committed. And so when you talk to producers, they have a core set of investments. They buy seed, they buy fuel, they buy fertilizer. They do that every year as what they see as fixed costs. And so when you talk to them about irrigation technology and water improvement, that's all really going to depend on how well they did last year and how well they think they're going to do this year and next year. And so, I've yet to meet a farmer that doesn't think about profit in a per acre position. And so when you're talking to them about investing $10 or $20 or $30 per acre into irrigation technology, they're already scratching out what that has to mean in yield bump in order to justify it, or cost savings. And frankly, you've got enough going on in the day that you really need the technology to do a lot of that math for you. If you're farming, 1,600, 2,000 acres, which is what a typical farm in Nebraska is, corn farm, to try to figure out per acre returns on that much ground, and some of it you own, some of it you rent, it really starts eating into your nights and weekends trying to figure out how to maximize. So as Trenton mentioned earlier, where it's got to start is as simple as it can be, sort of back of the envelope calculations, getting that person to understand how much water they have versus how much they need to do what they want to do.
Got it. And either you, Trent or John, maybe for folks that are less familiar with corn production, it's been explained to me that there's a certain number of inches required of rain throughout the season, and that is met completely on one side of Nebraska, but then on western Nebraska, it needs to be made up with an irrigated water from the Ogallala Aquifer. So I think the number is 28 inches, but is that correct?
Give or take. For number 2 yellow, that's a number to work with. And so, you have almost 30 inches of rain in southeast Nebraska, down where Missouri and Iowa and Nebraska all come together. That's a pretty wet part of the state, as opposed to the northwest corner where it's 15 to 18 on average. And so, what your relationship is with your groundwater depends on where you're at. We have good groundwater. I think there's 93 counties in Nebraska, and all but 4 of them are showing no or slight declines, and some are showing increases in their groundwater table. And where you're seeing the significant drawdowns is in the upper Republican, sort of where we border with Colorado. Some have suggested it's because Colorado sucks. And then clear up in the Panhandle, my apologies to any Coloradoans, you're fine people, I like y'all. But up in the very top of the Sandhills, there's a county that has pretty significant withdrawals, mainly because it's not hydrologically connected to the Ogallala Aquifer, so they're in a closed basin system. Ironically, they're growing sugar beets up there, which is a pretty high water crop. So over time, they'll have to figure out how to grow with less water or change away from sugar beets, because they're on a pretty steep decline with their water use right now.
And I feel like one of the last times I was out in Nebraska, I had sat down with a grower. I believe his name is Joe Walgreen, and we had this conversation about the returns to flow for the streams and how the state of Nebraska looks at what is sustainable for water usage. And we got into this interesting conversation about how they determined the year for the sustainability laws and what was optimal stream flow. And the year selected is 1997. And I was just curious, how do different entities come together and make this decision? And then how do they start to enforce it? Is it just looking at different sensors in different basins and understanding if we are achieving those levels? I think Trenton Justin Gibson has done some work on this where they're looking at, precipitation effects and how that changes river flows. So I was curious to get your understanding on how they make some of these determinations.
Yeah, I'm actually gonna kick this off to John so I don't get fired for violating the Hatch Act or something like that. So I'll let John tackle the political sort of water issues around groundwater. So go ahead, John.
Well, so Nebraska, being as progressive as we are, we determined sometime after a number of lawsuits that groundwater and surface water are indeed the same water, which seems, as a hydrologist, very intuitive, but as a policymaker, it was resisted for a lot of years because surface water management is governed by a different set of rules than groundwater management. And so the 97 date you're referring to is really the culmination of several policy acts in the 90s and early 2000s that sort of put Nebraska on the same page with all of its water resources. And 97, the magic of that year is that was the year that Nebraska was compliant in the Platte compact between, Nebraska, Colorado, and Wyoming. So there's nothing hydrologically unique about 1997. It was just the year that we had to start accounting for our water use in the Platte Basin to the other states in the federal government. And so that was the year they chose for statewide compliance. In terms of how good does that match up with use and depletion, the easy answer is not well at all. The policies are still in need of some update, and our understanding of use is, the science is always improving. And, water performance, it's only been within the last 5 years and at the insistence of people like myself and Trenton and others that it could even be done. There was sort of a black box, if you can't measure water at a watershed the same way you would at an individual field level. And so bringing in farmer use data for watershed modeling was verboten. And so that we've overcome a lot of those. There's still some hurdles to be met, but I think in the coming decade, we're going to see a lot more incorporation of that fine scale data from farm water use into watershed modeling, and that should bring us a clearer number. And this is just my opinion, but I think once we start getting that better data incorporated into those bigger projection models, we're going to see that a lot of the basins are not as far out of balance as was thought. And that's important because if you have to go to a severe restriction like hard cap allocations or retirement of acres, those take significant tax dollars to enact. And at the same time they're doing it, because property values are directly correlated with the ability to irrigate, if you have to reduce or remove irrigation from cropland, in some parts of the state, you can remove land value by half in doing that. So that erodes tax base, it erodes capital leverage for producers. And so it's not really a solution anybody's anxious to get to. So the better we can incorporate this water performance into our watershed management, I think the better our water sustainability and resilience future will be.
That makes a lot of sense. And I didn't realize there were so many I guess, other components attached to how you look at that transition. Trenton, I think you wanted to add something in about how the measurements were done.
Yeah, just one thing is, you know, a good indicator is sort of the water level. We do the assessment across the state every spring, so looking at those, you know, water level changes in the high plains aquifer are really useful to look at sort of those year-to-year changes. I think we've done that since the early 1930s. We have a great long-term data set where we can really, you know, assess some of those long-term trends and come up with some more local solutions and governance instead of a blanket, you know, policy across the state.
Is there when you're looking at those longer term trends, since some of these laws and acts have been enacted, have you seen a transition back the other way? Or I guess I'm just wondering, you know, how do you assess how it's going?
Yeah, so there's some great reports that the Conservation Survey Division puts out on sort of the, you know, the annual groundwater level assessments. And so certainly, you know, you'll see things like, you know, the transition from, you know, more, you know, flood irrigation to center pivot in the 1960s and 1970s. You see some of those impacts, as well as some of the regions where you still have a lot of surface canals, and you actually see, you know, elevated levels because of those leaky canals, and you have these, you know, water mounds kind of in central Nebraska that were still kind of, you know, storing that water over, you know, longer times underground. And then you also see, you know, the impact of sort of, you know, local regions like, you know, southwest Nebraska and some of those, you know, high depletion areas in the Republican River area. So, yeah, you definitely see that in sort of the, you know, some of these time series. So those are fun to look at as a groundwater hydrologist.
Cool. And then, you know, thinking about the combination of these, you know, what we're measuring today in watersheds, and then, you know, what we were talking about in terms of the water it takes to produce corn. You know, one of the things we were talking about last year at the UNL TAPS kickoff was if there's a way to apply water during certain growth stages in order to optimize yield outcomes, especially in water limited regions of Nebraska. And I was wondering how much of an, you know, when we looked at the TAPS data from last year and understanding the winners of TAPS and when they decided to irrigate, and if they were actually following a strategy like that, or I'm just wondering if progressive growers are starting to adopt this innovative tool, or if it's not really relevant to growers.
Yeah, John might have some insight there, sort of, you know, his extensive network with producers, but I certainly think, you know, their, you know, relationship with their, you know, crop consultants and kind of what they see on sort of the, you know, what works and science side of things and how that percolates up to the growers. There's a nice relationship there, but I'll let John tackle that one as well.
Yeah, I'm pretty fond of saying in Nebraska, and this probably works about anywhere in the ag community, farmers love their wives, but they listen to their agronomists. And so one of the challenges with improved water management is at the end of the day, yield is still the big dog in the yard. You know, when you think about counter-cyclical payments and FSA, those are based on yield. Crop insurance is based in yield. And so producers always sort of view their irrigation as insurance to bump. And I mean bump in yield. So until there's better data and we bring ag finance and ag policy more in line with the need to understand performance, you know, guys will take that risk if it's a good year and average prices, but if they have anything that's sort of out of condition where it's either low prices and dry, they're going to hedge towards over irrigation. And by the same token, if it's high prices, they may hedge towards it because they can bump yield. And so until you can help them get off that hamster wheel of chasing yield, their ability to be flexible in their irrigation You're seeing some guys do it. I think probably one of the biggest examples of guys changing their philosophy has been, you know, in the last 15 years, we've seen an incredible shift towards no-till. And some of that was because of high fuel prices and just the amount of time it was taken to do conventional tillage. But a lot of it came from the understanding that leaving that residue in the field helped to keep your root zone moist and keeping water in your active use zone for your crop. And so it's not as sexy as a computer app or a measurement device, but just seeing the amount of no-till increase to what it is, and I think will probably be to complete no-till sometime in the next 10 to 15 years. That's a significant water savings action. One of the issues with producers is that they know it's better, but they can't really put a measurement yet on how much better. So as a ag support community and hydrology community, that's one of the things that we probably need to put our tools on the job a little bit more, is figuring out how some of that low-tech innovation is really helping with long-term water management.
That makes sense. And then in terms of, you know, the other end of the food supply chain, as, you know, food companies are contracting these commodity inputs, and we're hearing, you know, all of the sustainability reporting, is there an effective scorecard or metrics to be tracking to start to encapsulate, you know, these numbers? And my feeling is that it's really hard to compare two different growers or two different fields, because the conditions are always so different that it's like apples and oranges between how effective folks are being and what they're starting with. So how do people look at this and then share that data with stakeholders to let them understand what's actually going on?
Yeah, I've worked on both ends of this, and my experience and opinion on it is that if growers want to fully take advantage of these type of supply chain initiatives or consumer-based environmental impact initiatives, they've got to figure out a way to measure conservation on their own for their own value. The supply chain initiatives tend to be highly variable. What one company considers conservation or sustainability could be very different from the next, and it varies on what you're able to do over regions. So the producer really needs to have better data management, and that's been a challenge. A lot of the new technology that's come to the farm has its own way of being recorded, and they don't typically integrate well with other forms of data. So a producer doesn't have an easy path to integrate and analyze their data to know how conservation oriented they are. So we need to work to build some better interfaces for that. And by that same token, then they, you know, let's just call that unit of conservation. If a farmer knows how many conservations he has, he knows whether or not it's in his best interest to join Pepsi or Coke or Walmart in one of their supply chain initiatives, because he can pencil it out in terms of his per acre cost and benefit. And he has a more marketable product to sell to those consumer-facing companies. And I think they would prefer that, because the amount of capital investment it takes to get growers to do specific outcomes. I did a project with Coca-Cola about half a dozen years ago. That's actually how Trenton and I met. They were measuring for their Replenish program, which was a global initiative, and they wanted to do a mass balance offset of water and other products that they put in Coke and what have you. And I remember the first conversation I had with their hydrologist, and he asked me how many liters of water we could conserve in Nebraska growing corn. And I said, well, I'm from Nebraska, what's a liter? But we don't think about water in liters when we work on the farm. We think about it in acre inches or acre feet. And so I think it's 1.162 million liters per acre foot. And when I started working numbers into acre feet down to liters, the phone dropped because it was so much bigger than what they were expecting. And you get that kind of cognitive dissonance between companies. You know, I don't go to the store and buy an acre foot of Coke. And so, you know, finding ways to translate value across those different platforms is still a challenge. And I think everybody wants to see it, but I think we're still quite a ways off from it.
Got it. And we're at time, and we have a couple of questions from the audience. So I'll read them out loud. The first is, do you see value in and maybe even the adoption of variable rate pivot irrigation across Nebraska?
Yeah, we already have a lot of VRI. Most of it is in wedge, you know, so it's degrees of around a circle. We're not seeing as much in the zone control, but guys are using it. And again, it really varies. The more yield production you have on a piece of ground, the more likely you are to have VRI, which is kind of backwards. We really need the lower producing stuff to be more responsive to VRI, but I think we'll get there.
Just to add, I think some of the more progressive producers I talk to are thinking about things in profitability zones and really trying to assess that from sort of a water, fertilizer and any other input costs in terms of production. So I think that's kind of the direction I think see things going, whether or not it makes sense for that piece of land to do speed or variable rate, full variable rate control is kind of a land specific kind of calculation.
Got it.
Yeah, and just to add to what Trenton just said, we're seeing zone control go in place in parts of the state where you have wetlands within farm ground, and so they'll use zone control to shut off over wetlands, so they don't put chemicals and so forth into these wetlands that are in the middle of farm fields. So there is some high rates of adoption in different parts of the state for that.
Got it. And more questions are coming in. Have farmers in your state embraced cover crops and compost applications to reduce irrigation needs? And if not, what have been the barriers to adoption?
You want to start on that one, Trent, or you want me to?
I'll start with the sort of microclimate argument. So, in the state, we have such a huge, rainfall gradient that I think, it's sort of a trade-off between, how much water the cover crops are using versus how much you leave in your soil profile. So there's a certain part of the state where, from a physics point of view, it probably doesn't make sense to have that extra vegetation depleting your root zone. So that, and we're not totally sure exactly where that line is, but you can make some reasonable guesses based off of sort of the general climate and soil conditions.
I would agree with that and add that, probably you have more candidates for that in eastern Nebraska where you have more soil erosion issues and better rainfall. But one of the big challenges that I've heard from producers about adopting cover crops is, price for the seed is not where they'd like it versus return. And also there's concern about whether or not they would have enough growing days and heat units to be able to get that crop to a sustainable level before the first freeze. And so I don't know how much of that is real versus perception, but a lot of guys I've talked to, when you ask them about it, they're worried about going out there and planting that seed and then getting an early frost and not getting any benefit from the cover crop. And so, and also I've heard some stories about what kinds of cover crops. A producer out in West grew turnips as a cover crop, and the residue actually tainted, I think it was edible beans that they went back in with, and lost over $100,000 in crop value because the beans smelled like turnips at the elevator. So, and believe it or not, that's one guy, but those kinds of stories get into the coffee shop, and it really inhibits people's desire to innovate.
Yeah, it's a lot of money. As a follow-up to this question, also, how much of the increased use of no-till is due to the rise in herbicide spraying for weed control?
Go ahead, John.
You know, I don't know that we're doing a lot. I mean, I would say we're doing less spraying for weed control in Nebraska, and it's more precision. Nebraska is the home of the center pivot. All of the major manufacturers are based here, and it's still the highest volume of pivot production. But when you talk to the manufacturers, they'll tell you they sell pivots around the world for water conservation, but in Nebraska, it's about time savings. And the rule of thumb back in the 80s when everybody was putting this in is every 4 pivots is 1 less hired man. And so no-till had the same effect in the farm community. Now all of a sudden you don't have to do all that pre-plant tillage. You get a lot better nutrient management with no-till. It definitely saves time and fuel. And so I don't think guys really are thinking about their no-till in relation to weed management as much as they did. I mean, when you ask the old timers why they tilled so much, they would all tell you it was because of vegetation management. But now I think they've kind of figured out that that's a bit of a fool's errand. So I would say very little of it is influenced by increased spraying.
And the last question, is subsurface drip irrigation a possible candidate in Western Nebraska based on cost-benefit analysis?
I'd say maybe. It depends on what part of the state you're in. I would say the further west you go, it has potential, but it would have to be heavily subsidized. The cost of installation is pretty prohibitive. And one of the things, there's a few crops that don't really respond to subsurface. Root crops specifically, potatoes are not good with subsurface, and sugar beets. And those are 2 big crops out in the panhandle. So I think it's going to have to be a combination of things like subsurface drip, but also figuring out better ways to do crop insurance that would allow the producer to irrigate less, figure out ways to mitigate risk from being able to do more rotation. So a lot of those guys out west have, they'll have 60 inches over 5 years, which is, 12 inches a year, but they might use 18 for the first 3 years and then go fallow for the next 2 to make up for that overuse. And that's really not well understood in the policy realm, how that affects producers. So I'd say subsurface plays a role, but I wouldn't say that it's going to be a magic bullet.
Got it. Thanks everyone for the questions. They were great today. And then John and Trenton, thank you so much for participating in our webinar series. So much information today. I hope we can have you both back on again soon.
Sure, glad to be here.
Thanks a lot, Jess.
Thanks.